So I'll just give it maybe 1 more minute for people to come in, and then we'll start. Okay, I think that we can start. Donc, hello, bonjour et quoi. Je m'appelle Mona Paré, je suis professeure à la section de droit civil à la faculté de droit. Je suis aussi vice-doyenne aux études supérieures à la faculté de droit et puis je dirige le laboratoire de recherche interdisciplinaire sur les droits de l'enfant, le LRED. So, bienvenue, welcome to all today. So, tout d'abord, je tiens à souligner que nous trouvons sur le territoire traditionnel du peuple Anishinaabe-Algonquin et nous leur rendons hommage et reconnaissons leur relation continue avec ce territoire qui demeure non cédé et dont ils sont les gardiens traditionnels. Alors, ça me fait très plaisir de vous accueillir à cette 4e conférence midi de l'année de notre laboratoire. Et je voudrais aussi remercier Jennifer Quaid, qui est vice-doyenne à la recherche de la section de droit civil, qui nous permet de présenter aussi dans le cadre du cycle de conférences de la section de droit civil. So, today's topic is on parental perspectives on upholding children's rights in the context of aggression towards families and caregivers in childhood and adolescence. And I understand it is an ongoing research that has been undertaken by our speakers here today. And I am very happy to introduce our speakers, who are my colleagues and members of the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on the Rights of the Child that we have here at the university. Nous avons Christine Gervais, who is Associate Professor from the Department of Criminology and the Faculty of Social Sciences, and she also is a member of the steering committee of the Child Rights Lab. We also have Elisa Romano, who's a professor at the School of Psychology and also director of the clinical program at the Faculty of Social Sciences and also a member of the lab. And we also have here today Danica DeCarlo Slobodnik, who is working on her master's in criminology at the Department of Criminology, Faculty of Social Sciences, and who has been working with Christine and Elisa on this project as a research assistant. So the presentations will be in English, but the speakers are happy then to answer questions in French also. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this research project. And so I'll keep the introduction very brief and I'll give you the floor. So there will be a presentation and then time for a question period at the end.
Merci, Mona. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know whether it's the slide, the first introductory slide. Thank you. All right. So thank you, Mona, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on the Rights of the Child within the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa for hosting this event and for providing financial support for the study upon which this presentation is based. We also acknowledge the funding that was granted through the Ottawa Community Foundation, as well as the support from the staff and volunteers from Adopt for Life and the National Consortium on AFCCA for having inspired us to develop this pilot study in Canada and for assisting us with recruitment through various networks across the country. We're very grateful to everyone who helped with recruitment, and we especially wish to thank the parents and caregivers who gave generously of their time and shared profound insights of very difficult personal circumstances, some of which we'll hear about today. We also recognize Dr. Julie Selwyn from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, who very kindly provided considerable amount of information from her own research on this topic in the UK, and upon which we were able to shape our study here in Canada. As Mona mentioned, today I'm joined by Dr. Lisa Romano, who is a co-investigator on this study. And in the first part of the presentation, she'll be highlighting the demographic information, the forms of AFCCA, and their impacts. I will then present on caregivers' perspectives on children's rights to treatment and support, after which Danica, the project's research assistant, will be presenting parents' perspectives on children's rights to be heard. And then Elisa will conclude the presentation by sharing some recommendations that were based on parents' insights. We begin by drawing your attention to this quote in which an adoptive mother of a 7-year-old daughter shared, "I often feel like the worst mom in the world, and I try so hard. My daughter can be the most sweet and loving person, and in 2 seconds flat, turn into the Incredible Hulk." We chose to highlight this statement at the outset because we felt that it really sets the tone of today's presentation on aggression toward family, caregivers in childhood and adolescence, hereafter referred to by its acronym AFCCA. And in our view, this quote reflects so many of the themes that we're addressing today. So first, the children's endearing qualities, which parents praise frequently during their interviews, but also the difficulties related to their child's varying capacities. And it also speaks to the parents' tireless efforts toward their child's well-being while underscoring the mental health impacts that they face. This quote and all the ones that we feature today provide just a preliminary snapshot of our findings. There were so many impressive comments and thoughtful considerations by parents in our sample, but since time is limited, we're really only able to provide a very short selection today. It was admittedly quite difficult to narrow down both the quantitative and qualitative findings to be featured today, but we'll certainly disseminate them in other presentations and publications in the future. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. So the goal of the study is to increase understanding of AFCCA among families within the Canadian context. Guided by a child rights perspective and a trauma-informed lens, we developed an online survey and interview guide. Data collection began in August and September 2021 and remains ongoing. The online survey has a mix of quantitative and qualitative items, and currently we have complete responses from 112 caregivers and parents. And for the interview, we currently have 17 parents who have participated. Next slide. While the study was open to all adoptive, kinship, and customary caregivers and parents across Canada, not all provinces and territories are represented in our current sample. However, we did have participation from the west to the east coast, and the majority of participants were from Ontario. In terms of the gender of survey participants, they identified as predominantly female, and we observed a similar breakdown with the interviews that were completed by caregivers. And regarding age, the majority of parents and caregivers were in their 40s and 50s. What we see here is that the majority of survey respondents, about 8 in 10, were adoptive parents. And for the category known as other, this would include foster parents, grandparents, as well as biological parents. And we also had representation from kinship caregivers as well as customary caregivers. So the next few slides share demographic information related to the children and the youth who were the focus of their parents' responses in the survey. And as we can see here, most children who exhibited aggressive behavior were identified as male, so about 52% of the sample, although it should be noted that there was also a relatively high number of female children and youth at about 42%. In terms of racial or ethnic background, caregivers and parents in our particular sample reported that the majority of children exhibiting aggressive behavior were white, and this is at 71%, followed by Indigenous children, comprising almost 20%, and then children who are Black, African Canadian, or Afro-Caribbean Canadian at almost 11%. In our sample, caregivers and parents reported that the onset of aggressive behavior occurred primarily by age 10 for the majority of children. So this was at 86%. And the onset of AFCCA for many children was as early as age 3 and 4. We asked survey respondents about a range of diagnoses and functioning issues that their children might be experiencing. And what we see here is the breadth of responses. The more frequent responses among parents centered around behavioral challenges, as well as academic and learning difficulties. There were also a number of concerns around emotional difficulties, attachment issues, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and intellectual functioning. And one thing that's worth noting is that some of these diagnoses and functioning issues may have direct relationships with aggressive behavior on the part of children and youth. So turning to AFCCA, we wanted to gather a better understanding of the various forms of aggression. And so we included survey items to cover a range of different types of aggression, from verbal and emotional, psychological, to physical and sexual forms of aggression. We asked caregivers not only about the actual display of these various behaviors on the part of their child, but also around threats related to these behaviors. And what this graph shows is the responses of parents to a question about the frequency of aggressive behavior directed toward them or another parent that might be in the home. And it is specific to the time period prior to the start of the pandemic in March of 2020. So with regard to verbal and emotional forms of aggressive behavior, what the findings show is that almost 50% of parents responded that these forms of aggression occurred frequently or almost daily. If we look at physical aggression, we see that a little over 1/3 of parents reported that their child never exhibited this form of aggression, but at the same time, about 1/3 also reported that this form of aggression occurred frequently or almost every day. With regards to sexual aggression, the overwhelming majority of parents in our study reported that this behavior was never exhibited toward them or another parent who might be living in the home. And then just finally going back to threats of aggression, what our findings show is that about 1/3 of parents noted that this never occurred for their child. But at the same time, 1/3 of parents also noted that threats of aggressive behavior toward them or another parent on the part of their child occurred frequently or almost daily. So we also wondered about whether any forms of aggressive behavior may have changed since the start of the pandemic. And with the exception of sexually aggressive behaviors, which we saw occurred very infrequently, most other forms of aggression, whether it was actual behavior or threats, either remained the same or worsened during the pandemic. And these findings may not necessarily be surprising for some of today's audience members, but it seems quite important to have documented Canadian data in this regard in order to demonstrate the serious attention that must be paid to the issue of AFCCA. As indicated in this slide, caregivers and parents clearly reported that their child's aggressive behavior generated serious consequences for themselves and for their family. The majority of caregivers reported moderately or extremely negative impacts on the well-being of the family. And as we show in the next slide, these impacts can take a variety of forms. Here is a listing of specific physical, social, and mental health impacts of AFCCA that were reported by parents for both themselves as well as for any children that might also be living in the home. We also wanted to highlight the financial toll on parents. For example, it can be quite costly in terms of mental health support that might not be always covered by parents' benefits or child welfare agencies. As well, there may be high costs associated for repairs to damaged household items and structural damage, such as broken doors and holes in walls. What we also found is that for some families, unfortunately, there was also an experience of a breakdown because of their child's aggressive behavior. Some of these breakdowns involve the young person no longer being able to live in the home, and others involved parental separation or divorce.
Thank you, Elisa. So we now turn to the qualitative content of today's presentation. And while the impacts that Elisa just noted are very difficult to endure and certainly to manage, especially when there are multiple children involved, we found that parents were truly exemplary in their consideration of their children's rights in a variety of areas, arguably all areas pertaining to their well-being. And among numerous other questions, and there were numerous questions on the survey, we do acknowledge that. Our survey and interview included 2 questions specifically related to children's rights. The first to treatment, support, and protection, as reflected in Article 40 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and to their rights to be heard, to express their views, and to seek information, as clarified in Articles 12 and 13 of the Convention. And those 2 questions also took into consideration the best interests of the child and parental responsibilities, as well as states' obligations to support parents and professionals in their child rearing efforts. Our findings point to challenges that parents faced in trying to accommodate their child's diagnoses and functioning issues, while trying to also hold them accountable for their behavior. And we'll also be reporting on the difficulties that parents encountered as they often had to consider the best interests of other children, mainly siblings, who were also negatively impacted by AFCCA. So as we can see from these responses from the survey, while there was understandably a mix of reactions and feelings about children's rights, or how children's rights guide parents' approaches, and how difficult it is to prioritize the needs of all children affected by AFCCA, overall, parents' genuine commitments were quite evident. So over the next several slides, we'll be illustrating various responses that are indicative not only of parents' steadfast commitment to upholding their child's rights, but also, as we mentioned earlier, to the complex challenges that they encounter in doing so. In this section, we're emphasizing 4 main themes that emerged from the parents' responses to the question, what is it like to prioritize your child's right to support, treatment, and protection when they've acted aggressively towards you or their other parent and or their siblings? So the 4 main themes are: first, prioritizing the child's best interest. The second involves considering the safety of siblings. The third pertains to the frustrating implications for parents. And the 4th theme consists of strategies that parents adopted to manage AFCCA more effectively. So in this first of 5 slides on the first theme of prioritizing the child's best interest, we begin with a comment that was actually made in direct response to the articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we had only included in the question for clarification purposes and certainly not for evaluation reasons. Now, recall that the question asked, what is it like to prioritize your child's rights? And it was mainly intended to elicit responses related to feelings and strategies. Now, this parent's account must be understood in the context of her professional field in which she works on other UN declarations. So her familiarity with international legal obligations partly influenced her initial and somewhat lighthearted yet stress-based response. So this 51-year-old adoptive mother of an 11-year-old daughter in Ontario started by saying, so my first parental reaction was, oh, you mean I have to do more and I'm going to be assessed against every article? I can't do any more. It is exhausting to the very core of my being. Yet in the second part of her statement, we can see how she's very attentive to her daughter's rights and she's quite aware of the importance of them. So she continued to clarify, but it doesn't diminish her rights in my mind. It doesn't mean that I get a pass, that I not prioritize her rights. And when I signed up to be her parent, I signed up to nurture her and love and provide for her. And I didn't know that it was going to be as hard as it is. So in the moment, I just want to scream and say, stop it, stop it, stop it. But I know from experience that doesn't work. And it's not empowering to my child and it's not helping her to grow. I'm just going to leave this for a minute. Okay. So in response to the same question, another parent was exemplary, not only in her child-centered approach to addressing her daughter's behavior and prioritizing her safety, but also in how she facilitates child-friendly communication amongst all of her children. So this 35-year-old mother of a 7-year-old daughter who was adopted at the age of 4 in Ontario explained that, I ask my kids every day, what is my job? They'll say, Mom and Dad need to keep us happy, healthy, safe. No matter. I have to put her safety even above my safety, even if it means that I may be hurt. She has the right to be safe, and she doesn't always understand what that might be. So she can't advocate that for herself. So sometimes I will be put at risk to keep her safe. Here we see the same mother again prioritizing her child's well-being, yet acknowledging how difficult it is. So in the first quote, she refers to physical injuries that she's endured. And in the second one, she emphasizes more of the emotional toll. So she illustrated her commitment so clearly and convincingly, as she stated, I've been to the hospital where I thought she broke my hand, or I've been to the chiropractor because she injured my back. But on the worst day, she still has the right to be happy, healthy, and safe. But she also clarified, well, I'm not going to lie, there are times I just scream, I'm not perfect, and I have lost it. And then I'm like, I'm sorry, Mommy yelled at you, that was not okay. And there are times when I've gotten in the car and I've driven, and I'm like tapping out. Sometimes you just need to get away from your tiny human when they've drawn blood from you and they're still going. So it's obvious that this mother is very self-aware of her own limitations, and the way in which she acknowledges that with her daughter reflects very considerate child-centered communication on her part. As this mother recognized the complications resulting from altercations between parents and children, she underscored that such heightened reactions were themselves the grounds upon which children's rights should be upheld. So this 54-year-old mother of a 9-year-old son adopted at the age of 4 from British Columbia clarified, well, I don't feel that heat of the moment tensions should get in the way of those rights. I think maybe it gives even more reason to ensure that those rights are adhered to, because I think it is hard to hold all those things around the rights of the child in mind when your own safety is being violated. Do I still think that we should? Yes, I do. It's not always possible, maybe. Next, as we hear from a 50-year-old mother of an 11-year-old adopted daughter from Ontario, 2 considerations come to light. First, there's a recognition of her child's varying capacities and how the parents have adapted accordingly. So here the mother explained, so because we understand her brain differences and what she is capable and not capable of, we tend not to do many things that are punitive because she doesn't get consequences. Now, the second part of the quote refers to how some rights may be compromised in order to uphold other rights that are deemed essential in prioritizing the child's best interest. at least from the perspective of this parent. So the mother clarified her reasoning here. At the same time, I do sometimes violate her right to privacy because I need to talk with people to keep her safe. So there are times when I tell neighbors about her diagnosis because I need them to help. So her privacy goes out the window because her safety is more important. A second major theme that emerged from the parents' responses to that same question was the safety of brothers and sisters. So this first quote shows how parents often place themselves intentionally and directly in harm's way in order to protect their other children. In this case, we can see that the mother was not only attentive to the brother's well-being, but she was also quite mindful of some potential implications for her 7-year-old daughter who was exhibiting AFCCA. Specifically, she was worried about mitigating possible regrets on her daughter's part. So she explained, even for my son, if I have to get between the two of them and it means me being injured or him, I'll always pick me because I fear she'll do something that she can't take back. The other two quotes were conveyed by parents who had to make the difficult decision to relocate their sons who were exhibiting AFCCA and place them in a youth care setting. So this refers to the example of family breakdown that Lisa made reference to earlier on in terms of some of the impacts. So while all parents in this position explained that they made such a choice because they and the professional involved felt that it was the best option for the child or youth who was exhibiting AFCCA, given the complicated circumstances and the need for specialized supports. They also reported that another major reason was that they could no longer keep their other children safe. And most of the parents clarified that they were willing to put up with their child's aggression when it was only directed towards them, but they were not willing to tolerate it when the siblings were impacted or were at risk. So they felt that other alternatives had to be put in place. So this second quote is by an adoptive mother of a 17-year-old son, and she illustrates this. And as she states, when we made that call to have him removed, we said we're doing this for the safety of our daughter. The third quote is by an adoptive mother of a 13-year-old son, also exhibiting AFCCA, and she was quite concerned about the well-being of her other adopted son, who was younger and perceived as vulnerable. Here she explained, and she was quite emotional when she said this, his brother himself deserves to have a safe home, and it just breaks my heart that his brother didn't feel safe for so long. And just to clarify, in terms of these family breakdowns or the removal, there are different ways in which they can be referred to, but a lot of parents refer to them as co-parenting arrangements. And as they work closely with the professionals and the staff in the youth care homes, and the parents spoke a lot about the benefits of these arrangements, however difficult it was to initiate them. They referred to them often as life-saving changes, and they found that these new arrangements allowed them to reestablish a sense of safety and calm within their own homes, and it also led to noticeable improvements in the well-being of all family members overall. So not necessarily an ideal option in some regards or depending on circumstances. And for some, it's definitely not the first option and tends to be a last resort. But in some cases, the importance of safety prevailed. Still in keeping with the theme of sibling safety, this next example is a very concrete illustration of how parents have to navigate the best interests of all children in their home. In this case, there was an incident in which the son exhibiting AFCCA was upset, and he found a box of winter boots, and he started to whip them down the stairs as the other children were going out the door to school. So the mother was obviously very concerned that the other 4 children, who were also adopted, so there are 5 adopted children within this family, that they were going to get hurt by the very big, heavy winter boots that were being thrown or pelted, as the mother expressed it. So here, this 40-year-old mother of a 14-year-old son who was adopted at 18 months from Ontario explains how she tried to protect the other children. So I'm standing there as the physical barrier so they can get out the door. And it's more important that they don't get hit than it is for me to get hit. And she went on to explain how the situation became more complicated as she tried to rush another more slow-moving son out the door to avoid further injury to herself, because the longer the other children took to get out the door, the more she was being hit by the boots. And as we see by her additional anecdote here, she clearly felt deflated as she tried to consider the well-being of all of her children that day. So I'm like, get out. I'm screaming at him, and you just feel no matter what you do, everybody loses. Somebody's going to be miserable, right? But that's how it felt to prioritize their best interests. Over the next 2 slides, we focus on the theme of parental safety. So this entire quote illustrates not only the reality and gravity of injuries that parents can sustain, but also how parents sometimes feel frustrated with the implications of balancing their children's needs and their own parental well-being. So this 40-year-old mother questioned this context rather emphatically. So it feels so overwhelming, just the toll that it's taken on my mind and body. And because society and all the service providers, they're there to meet the child's needs, even CAS. My son breaks my finger and then CAS gets involved to make sure that he's safe. Like what? Yes, the child needs come first, but everything is centered around the child. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but it really leaves no space for the parents. So as is evident here in this latter comment, this mother certainly believes that children's rights do remain the priority, that she also feels that parents' needs cannot be overlooked either. So we'll return to the importance of this dual focus as we present recommendations later. Another mother clarified the complications that parents sometimes face in trying to balance their child's rights and their own need for safety. So in this case, the son was living in a group home or youth care setting, and as the parents planned a family visit at the facility, the mother tried to communicate her safety concern to the staff. So here, this 50-year-old mother explained, so he has the right to be alone with his family with nobody listening in, but that frightens me. So she asked the staff to consider their safety as well. And here's how she worded her question. Could you emphasize that we have the right not to be alone with him? Again, it's pointing to complex considerations for everyone involved, not easy to navigate. Now for the 4th and final theme that I'm addressing today, we turn to some solutions over the next 2 slides. So in response to the same question about what it was like to prioritize their child's rights when they're acting aggressively towards them, some parents referred to examples of very intentional strategies that they had developed. Here, 2 mothers recognize how their feelings could potentially distract them from properly focusing on their daughter's needs. So they proactively and very deliberately distinguish between their own emotional needs and from those of their child so that they can concentrate on their daughter's best interests more effectively. So the first mother here is very considerate in her approach. When she's being violent and it's hard not to meet her where she's at, but she's not capable of controlling herself. I'm capable of controlling myself. So I have to stay calm in the moment, and I've got to clean up the mess of myself later. The second mother was equally thoughtful as she reflected on her frustration over all the disruptions in her own life as a result of her daughter's behavior. I have to keep that compartmentalized because I don't want that to become too much of a resentment because I can't support her well if I resent her. So again, very thoughtful in their considerations here. And similarly, this 47-year-old adoptive mother of a 9-year-old daughter from Ontario referred to one of the concrete communication strategies that she follows in order to help her prevent potential escalation. So I understood it more that this is what's required for her. It's not her fault that this is all happening. And even still, when she's aggressive with me, I'm defensive or I'm angry, and I don't always say the best thing. So I have Post-it notes on the fridge. And one, for example, says, I can see that you're struggling right now. What can I do to help you? Because at the time, I can't articulate it. I'm still practicing it, and I'm still learning. And to that point on ongoing learning, I think it's really important to underscore how resourceful all of the parents with whom we've spoken, and for those who responded to the surveys, have been just quite exemplary in their dedication and endless efforts towards searching out other options and the best supports for their child. In addition to the direct professional support through counseling, mental health care, they also try to be as informed as possible. This mother in particular made reference to various sources, websites, different email exchanges, Instagram. She mentioned that recently she had learned a great deal from podcasts. So just, I think, a testament to the extent to which these parents are so heavily invested in the well-being of their child, both in the immediate term and taking into consideration the long term as well, despite the challenges that their own behavior presents to them. And I'm going to pass it on to Danica now.
Thank you, Christine. So the second question we asked parents on children's rights explored how they felt about respecting their child's right to express their views, to be heard, and to seek information. Similar to the other child's rights questions that Christine spoke to, there were a range of responses on the survey, but most answers indicated parents' commitment to respecting their child's right to be heard. The majority of them acknowledge that these principles do guide their approach in dealing with their child's aggressive behavior, either a great deal or quite a bit, as we can see on the graphic. Most did not seem to find it challenging to prioritize their child's right to be heard when they've acted aggressively towards them or their siblings. And as well on the graphic, we can also see how somewhat is a common response to all of the questions, which points to some of the complexities of these circumstances. Some of our preliminary analyses also show us that parents may be more willing to put up with talking back, for example, when it's directed towards them, the parents or caregivers, rather than the child's siblings. There's potentially a protective response here that occurs with siblings more than with the parents themselves. Perfect. So we asked parents, what's it like to respect their child's right to express their views and to be heard when they've been aggressive towards them and their siblings? We heard many of the caregivers acknowledge that it was complicated, but they'd learned to be strategic in order to ensure everyone's well-being. So venting and validating is one of the themes that emerges here. In this first set of responses, we see that despite the challenges, including countless hurtful words, often very harsh swearing, profanity as one mom called it, many parents have opted to respect their child's right to be heard by allowing them to vent and then validating what they say. So as the first mom says here, they will let her vent, they try to be patient, and they actually do a surprisingly good job at it given the circumstances. We can see the second mother. She says, we want to hear your feelings. You can feel all these different things. Your feelings are your feelings. They're real, but it's not okay to physically harm. And they're just trying to draw where that line is. Sometimes, though, that validation is a challenge. So this mother tells us that she lets her daughter vent. She tries to be understanding, but again, sometimes that validation piece can be difficult because the child's words may not seem coherent or comprehensible. As she notes, this can create a strained relationship for some parents, especially when we consider parents' own experiences in their own lives and difficulties, and of course, their respective communication styles and thresholds. We can see here that she explains how it can be different for her husband than it is for her. Again, this mother says she lets her daughter ride that emotional wave. She acknowledges what her daughter's feeling from her perspective, but she will tell her when what comes out doesn't make sense. And this was also a pattern that we saw in some other interviews as well, that challenge with comprehension. So another major finding that emerges relates to not being believed. Many parents reported feeling frustrated because relatives, friends, even professionals don't seem to believe them or fully realize the extent and the severity of AFCCA that they're experiencing. The mother quoted here reported an additional complication with her son, who has a tendency towards lying. She felt that he often defaults to being deceitful. And so it's challenging to listen to his views because she and others have to sort out what's reality, what's perception, and what's manipulation in those circumstances. It's not always clear. So that confusion made it difficult to balance between accommodating their son's needs and functioning issues, but also holding him accountable. As she says, she understands that social services have to listen to the child, but they were listening to him and no one was listening to his brother who felt unsafe. Again, she understands that he has to be heard and she highlights that that's important, but she also expressed that it was difficult that no one was hearing them and taking into consideration that situation that caused it to happen. And again, she doesn't know she's had a lot of social workers say, well, he's just a kid, he can't be doing that. And she said, yes, he is a kid and he can be doing these things that are harmful. And continuing with this theme, this mother and father responded to the question about considering their son's right to be heard. And in doing so, they expressed their frustration around not being believed. They revealed their fear of potentially more serious harms, calling into question the problematic implications of their son's right to express his views when they involve serious threats. This is reminiscent of another parent's interview as well, where fear was expressed related to potential fatal consequences. There's a lot of emotion and of course, seriousness and complication to these situations. So another theme that emerges relates to complications with consent. The mother quoted here acknowledges that it is important to respect her son's right to be heard, but there were worries or concerns over his potential to disagree with treatment plans related to FASD and his aggressive behavior. And as a result, the parents feared that his right to be heard may compromise his right to treatment. So she says, unless he will sign it, or that the hospital referral and the service providers said that unless he signs a consent, they wouldn't engage. And yeah, that was difficult for them because, all it takes is getting him on the wrong day and he says no, and this all falls apart, as she says. The same mother also conveyed a really genuine and impressive attempt to respect her son's right to be heard, to express his views, and to seek information through transparent communication and inclusive involvement in discussions related to his well-being. She says here, it's daily practice, always a work in progress. We've always just tried to talk really openly while setting the boundary of what's okay and what's not okay in our house. So she says to him, you have a right to be in conversations that are about you. You have a right to come to that meeting. You have a right to know what dad and I and the counselor are talking about. And she says that they're very intentional and open about things. So in terms of strategies that have emerged so far, we see this one of listening safely from a distance. So parents or caregivers listening safely. Here's an example of a mother she said she used a chair as a barrier, and she outlined the expectation that he had to sit in it and she would only listen to him speak when he was sitting in the chair. So she's trying to balance her own safety while also prioritizing her child's right to be heard and listened to. Despite her efforts, there are still times when that barrier doesn't serve its purpose, unfortunately. So as she says, it's tricky. It doesn't always work, to the point where at one situation, he even, as she says, grabbed my wrists and restrained me. So we can see that these are very difficult circumstances to navigate, but there is an attempt to balance rights and protection, as we can see clearly here and in many of the parents' stories. So another strategy that emerged relates to depersonalization. So rather than letting harsh words affect them, some parents are able to put things into perspective, so they can consider the real source of the problem. Points to a deeper understanding of their child's right to be heard while recognizing their varying capacity to express themselves clearly. So as the first mother here says, her son has a right to be heard, and if things are escalated, she feels that it's their duty to investigate, to find the root anger there. And then the other mother quoted below asks as well, what's this really about? She speaks to the strategy of depersonalization, which she says helps to mitigate the difficulties for her when there is escalation. So while there are mixed perspectives on the use of medication, in some cases, like this one, the mother viewed it as a positive intervention with beneficial outcomes. She mentions medical intervention as a means to help the child with verbal communication and to minimize the use of aggression. Here we saw that her son was able to explain that he was really scared when he was away from home instead of throwing stuff as he typically would. and his mother validated those feelings and acted accordingly. She felt that medication helped him to articulate his feelings and fears better. And so they were able to respect his right to be heard and express views, and then subsequently better respond to his needs, his right to treatment and support. So there's a harm reduction element to the account that we present here, as well as some of the others as well. In this case, the verbal expression of anger or frustration is recognized by the mother as a noticeable improvement over the aggressive behavior that her daughter tended to exhibit towards her prior. So despite the tensions that come with heightened verbal exchanges, they're seen here as a lesser form of aggression compared to physical harm. The mother said she had noticed that shift over the course of the pandemic. So she's relieved to see some improvement. Again, that improvement was a decrease in physical aggression, albeit an increase in verbal aggression. And even with the verbal aggression, she is starting to observe some improvements. She noted to us that she'd curbed it for the most part through a reward system that she started to follow, and that was working for them as well. So she says, I do see this as her right to communicate. I never thought of it in that way, but just kind of like, yeah, there's no wrong emotion. You can't help to feel what you feel. So she tries to educate her child on it, and she would much rather her verbalize than be aggressive with her or internalize it.
Thank you, Danica. So I'll spend a few moments now talking about the number of recommendations that emerged from the information that parents and caregivers shared with us. These recommendations are really in line with the child-centered approach and with the CRC articles that we have considered around the best interests of the child, parental responsibility, children's rights to treatment, support, and protection, as well as children's rights to be heard, to express their viewpoints, and to have information in matters that directly affect them. In terms of specific recommendations, first and foremost, it's critical that we all truly listen to what parents are telling us with open minds, with empathy, and with no judgment. We cannot presume to know what they are experiencing as parents and as a family. Thank you. It's clear that they're incredibly judged and stigmatized, often by those who are close to them and even by themselves. And this contributes to isolation and increased difficulty for the entire family. We also need to draw attention to parents' efforts to advocate, not only on behalf of their child's needs, but also on behalf of the needs as a family as a whole, including other children in the home as well as themselves. And these efforts need to be respected and addressed. What we understood from our discussions with parents so far is that multiple considerations must be taken into account when advancing children's rights to well-being and to factors that promote their well-being. And at the heart of all the parents' recommendations was their child. Here they spoke about access to such services as psychodiagnostic assessments, mental health interventions. And they spoke not only about access to services, but to services in a timely manner, to affordable services, and to high quality services that adopted a trauma and attachment-informed perspective for their child's aggressive behavior. In this graph, what the model shows is that a child's well-being and functioning is central and is impacted by a number of systems in which that child is embedded. As such, recommendations to support a child's well-being and functioning need to also support individuals in the various systems that surround a child. And this is precisely what parents emphasized in their discussions with us. So they spoke about access to timely, affordable, and high-quality mental health services, not only for their child, but also for themselves to address their own well-being. Without a parent who feels supported and validated, and who can learn and implement parenting skills within a helping professional relationship, it becomes quite difficult to care for the well-being of a child and to support that child's many needs, especially in light of past trauma and its impact on behavior and functioning more generally. The parents and caregivers in our study also spoke about supports for themselves in terms of respite, in-home support, parent support groups, and also supports for their children in terms of specialized opportunities such as adapted learning, trauma-informed and diagnosis-specific recreational camps and activities. And they also spoke about the importance of supports to manage the needs and the well-being of other children in the home. We know that a family is a dynamic system, and when one individual is struggling, everyone is impacted. And by the same token, when individuals are feeling well and able to carry out their daily activities and responsibilities, especially parents who are at the head of a household, then everyone benefits. What you see in this model on the graph is not only all the systems in which children are embedded, but also arrows indicating that systems interact with one another, impact one another, and ultimately impact one another in a way that affects the well-being and functioning of the child. The parents who shared their experiences with us spoke about recommendations that align with those arrows and those interactions among different systems. They spoke about the need for relationships with other systems of care, such as child welfare, health, education, to be ongoing, collaborative, non-judgmental, validating, and supportive. And these are trauma-informed perspectives. And they highlighted how relationships are really key to reducing feelings of isolation and facilitating positive change. In addition, these other systems of care need to really help parents navigate this complex landscape surrounding the needs of their child with challenges around aggression, as well as the needs of other children in the home and the needs of parents themselves. And many parents, as we saw in the presentation, spoke about how they bore the responsibility to find services for their child and for their family and to really learn on their own. And finally, although it's not represented in this model, there's a whole other layer around all these systems. And that layer is at the level of society. And the parents in our study did speak about increasing awareness of the topic of AFCCA. And with increased awareness comes a reduction in misinformation and myths and misconceptions that can really contribute to feelings of guilt and isolation. And what information does and awareness does is open the door for greater understanding and support, which ultimately benefits everyone.
Thank you, Elisa. And just as a last highlight here, these are messages that were shared with us from parents, as echoing what Elisa just mentioned, with the recommendations, the need for more attention, and just asking us to do everything that we can. And so we're certainly committed to that, to disseminating this information in a variety of forums with key stakeholders, where we can hopefully see change occur. So we definitely look forward to the next steps in that regard. But in the meantime, we're happy to answer any questions that you may have, and we'll open the Q&A or the chat. And do you want me to, Mona, I'm assuming we'll stop the screen sharing?
Yes, I think you could stop the screen sharing, and then we can take. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, very thought-provoking, for sure. And we'll see if there are any questions from the participants. I don't see any in the. Does the Q&A or the chat? I have not seen anything yet. Well, I'm curious to know, I understand that, you haven't finished the project, and so where is this taking you for your next steps?
The microphone is on. Well, certainly in a variety of directions. So as I mentioned, the plan is to disseminate this information through a number of venues, including academic ones. So as we mentioned at the beginning, it was important to initiate this pilot study within Canada so that we can document what's occurring in a Canadian context. And that's important to lend credibility to the voices of parents and to all those who are supporting them, to demonstrate the need for additional resources. And so that's definitely part of the plan. But to complement that, as we heard through various parents' comments, some frustrations and challenges with various systems of care, including child welfare. And so our intention is to share some of what parents have emphasized with us, with key stakeholders in the areas of child welfare, for one, in the criminal justice system and policing, where families unfortunately have had some interactions and they haven't necessarily been positive. So there's certainly some work to do in terms of improving support in that area, as well as in the education systems. So in the mental health components of education systems within school boards, but also parents also relate to us some of the struggles that they had with teachers and principals and communicating their child's needs. So there was a lot of advocacy that's been done on the part of parents to really clarify their child's diagnoses, or in cases where diagnoses or functioning issues are suspected but are not yet diagnosed, there's a gap in the service or the support that the child requires, often in the school setting. So there are a number of spaces where we intend to share the feedback that's been provided to us so that these key stakeholders can recognize the gaps in their services and improve them. And if I may share, there's also hopefully a next phase to this, depending on funding that we're waiting to hear about, is to consult directly with the young people themselves. And so Danica will hopefully be part of that, leading that part of the project, to take the time to hear those perspectives so that we have a better sense of the more comprehensive sense of the entire family's functioning challenges.
Well, that will be very interesting. And I haven't seen a lot of questions in the chat there, but a lot of thank yous, and having done very, very important research. I think there clearly wasn't much out there. You have findings, like really unique findings, important that will then allow for discussion and creating those links that you discussed also at the end. There was just one question about what about young people over 18 who've had those that kind of difficulties when they were younger, but still do. Is that something you've looked at all or are going to?
So no, not yet. And that's definitely part of the second phase. So when I mentioned our consultation or inclusion of youth voices or as first voice experts, that will include young people under the age of 18, maybe currently exhibiting AFCCA, but we're also including, as you just mentioned, the young adults who have experience and are able to shed light, perhaps in a more retrospective way, on their experiences. So we'll be including both age ranges, but all under the understanding that they're young, and it's important to take into consideration their lived experiences at various stages.
Okay, so yeah, that's the next part of the next stage. Then there's a question about you sharing results, and are you planning on sharing the findings on social media and other platforms that's more accessible for the general population and not just academic circles?
Yes. Yeah, so that's definitely a work in progress, but definitely part of the plan, especially with the extended youth project that we have in mind. But yes, we have another team of research assistants who will be under Elisa's direction within psychology, who will be assisting us with the data analysis as well. So we'll be definitely disseminating all of those results in a variety of forms, but definitely, yeah, a mixed dissemination plan. And if anyone has any ideas in that regard, or if there are gaps in what you're seeing that we're doing or not doing, we're more than welcome to hear about that, so we can improve on the creating further awareness.
Okay, so if anybody there among participants has any ideas, you can also welcome to share those. Are there any other questions? It's certainly, oh, here, how to participate in future research.
Okay. Well, thank you for that interest. You can definitely contact us directly, and then we can follow up to make arrangements. That's very much appreciated.
And in terms of that, like for solutions, for possible solutions, and you know that this is something that you've discussed already with the participants, and you've been able to draw ideas, but are you going to also do something to help to put those solutions into practice? How are you going to contribute there, in addition to disseminating the findings? Did you have any plans for that?
Yes, well, as if I may kind of recall a previous study that Elisa and I collaborated on with families who were experiencing different yet somewhat similar circumstances with offending on the part of their children. We did work with parents to develop different outputs that they felt were needed. So we kind of co-created a pamphlet with parents. Again, that's more of an awareness piece, but part of our intention in response to your question is that we certainly want to maintain the contact with the parents, so that as we're preparing that delivery, we certainly want to continue consulting with them, so that they can, again, continue to have input on what that should look like and what gaps that we're trying to fill. So definitely going forward, and part of the intention here is to collaborate with the National Consortium that has been working very hard over the last year as well. So hopefully part of what we're generating in terms of results will be drawn into some of their work in terms of policy development, and again, creating awareness through various sectors across various provinces and at various levels, both provincial as well as federal. So definitely planning to work in conjunction with several community partners and organizational partners to see that see those changes occur long term.
Then I see there's a question about the children and young people participating in the next phase. So how are you going to be able to recruit if they have difficulty admitting that they exhibit aggression?
Oui, bonne question, Karine, merci. Yes, that's definitely a challenge. It will certainly be a barrier to recruitment, and we're mindful of that. So we'll have to be dependent on those who are open and willing, and we are planning to consult prior to finalizing the the study with the young people. As we're preparing the ethics application and creating the interview guide and the survey and possibly focus group guides as well, we will be consulting with a core group of young people who are familiar or have exhibited AFCCA themselves. And so we'll be drawing on their insights on how to address recruitment issues as well. So we'll be kind of leaning on their experiences to have a better understanding of how to recruit as widely as possible. But it's not just a matter of recruitment. Part of the intention of that consultation is more to address this issue as inclusively and as appropriately as possible, so that what we're creating is reflective of what this means to them, what they feel should be represented from their perspective as well. So it'll be a matter of kind of process and content that we're seeking as a collaboration with them.
I'm also wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the recruitment for this project. Like, how did you go about that? Like, did you have criteria to make sure that there's a certain, representation of different groups, or like whoever wanted to participate could participate?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, for this the pilot study, we benefited from the collaboration of Adopt for Life and many of the parallel organizations that existed across other provinces through which they had already established networks and other relationships. But it wasn't limited to those networks either. It was open to all families across all provinces and territories. But we certainly recognize that the dissemination of our recruitment material kind of navigated across or through those networks in that smaller circle through Adopt for Life support. We also had additional support through the province of Quebec as well by someone who's, a colleague who's very generous in disseminating the recruitment. So there was a better representation there, but definitely intending to expand our recruitment connections. So not only working in the context of adoption or kinship or customary care, but open to all families who are experiencing these issues. And so certainly we'll be in touch with other organizations that are supporting family and mental health care services, child welfare services across other sectors or within other provinces as well. So definitely a much wider recruitment is planned for the next phase. And then, so there will be two phases. One is like an extension of this initial project so that it's inclusive of more families. And as I mentioned, not only in terms of adoption and kinship or customary care. So wider geographically, but wider also in terms of the types of families that we'll be including. And then that second component was specifically focusing on the youth's perspectives.
And I'm just continuing because because I don't see questions, but please, everybody, just don't feel shy and ask your questions through the Q&A or the chat. But I was wondering also what made you choose a children's rights perspective, and it is obviously a very challenging type of situation from a children's rights perspective, and you could see also from some of the discussions and responses you got from the participants that that kind of approach it's there, but it's challenging to apply it. So what was the objective from using such a perspective?
Mm-hmm. Elisa, did you want to add anything there before I do, or if there's something that comes to mind, feel free.
Yeah, sure. I guess in many ways, many of our perspectives are grounded in children's rights, and it seemed like, at least with this topic, that it might be perhaps easier to lose sight of what might be going on for a child, given the complexity of the behavior and some of the negative impacts that can have on the well-being of many people. And I don't know, Christine, if you want to build on that, but I think from our perspective, it was a sort of a way to talk about such a complex issue and the many impacts, and also respecting I think, the uniqueness of the child within that complex landscape, and how to understand some of that aggressive behavior in terms of their needs, their rights to be heard, while also, I think, managing the rights and the needs of the bigger system, right? As we saw in that graph, that children are not just growing up in isolation, and we really need to think about the dynamic nature of the family and the well-being of everybody within that system, all of whom are working for the child but are also impacted by the child. And I think it was a way to sort of be mindful of those many rights and needs, and not lose sight of the child within all of that complexity.
Mm-hmm. If I may add as well, there was that one quote that I just, because I knew time was limited, that I didn't continue on, but it was a section or a segment at the end where the mom added, after she was reflecting on the types of strategies that she had put in place, the Post-it notes was the key example there. But she also had shared that, you know, she had never really thought of this as her daughter's right per se, but it was more of, what can I do to be the best parent I can for this child? So she thought of it, instead of children's rights, it was more a matter of best practice parenting. And one of the things that came to mind as we heard many parents reflect on the child's rights lens that we had included within some of the questions, we had some really interesting discussions and clarifications. I think what we need to be mindful of is that understanding, I think, goes both ways. I think there's a mutual reinforcement here, or an opportunity for that here, because what stood out for us was that as much as these parents weren't necessarily working within a child's rights lens, like as we may know, or using that type of vocabulary and maybe not familiar with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what they were doing on a daily basis was so child-centered, child-focused, and so exemplary. They were modeling children's rights without, again, using that particular vocabulary. And so I think there's an opportunity for the child rights scholarship to benefit from the insights of these parents, from, you know, personal experiences and other sectors that they were, and systems that they were drawing attention to in terms of gaps. So I'm looking forward to exploring that dimension of this, because again, just the extent to which these parents were exemplary on so many levels, just as dealing with the challenges that they were on a daily basis, and not only the emotional, psychological toll, but actual physical harms, yet still maintaining their position on the child being prioritized in these circumstances. So I think there's a lot to be gained from these insights that can really inform a child rights dialogue or lens in really interesting ways.
Thank you. There are two questions here, one from Michelle Young and from Karine Tremblay. Michelle Young saying, I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but during the study, did you notice in some cases the behavior fluctuated over time? And was it present during a younger age, but then left and came back later on during puberty? Like, did you see differences there for a child fluctuating over time that the parents would have told you about?
Mm-hmm. Hey, Lisa, did you want to speak to that based on what you shared with the?
Yeah, I think in terms of taking that kind of dimension over time, it wasn't really captured to the extent that maybe could answer that question in terms of overdevelopment and over time. But what we did notice is, at least from before the pandemic until during the pandemic, and there what the findings showed is that the pandemic served to really, in many ways, increase the frequency and the severity of some of the aggressive behavior on the part of the child and the youth. And we can all think about what the reasons are there, right? Just in terms of the stresses of living through a pandemic, and sort of how the protections really affected the family life and the life of that young person as well. And some of the other hardships as well that are encountered by families and young people during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that, I think more anecdotally what we learned, especially within the interviews, was not so much a fluctuation as is highlighted within this question of noticing that was it present during younger years but left and came back? It seemed to be in most instances a steady increase over time, especially as the child progressed into the adolescent phase. There were parents, as you know, one of the examples that Danica had presented was recognizing that there was a shift from the physical aggression towards greater use of verbal aggression, and for the mother that was seen as a kind of harm reduction scenario. But for the most part, what parents reported was more of a steady increase in both frequency and severity during the adolescent phase. And that's not necessarily all, because some did talk about the benefits of early intervention and how they noticed changes based on different strategies that they were able to put in place based on professional counseling. So definitely a range, but for the most part, an increase. And Danica, if there's anything that you want to share with any of these questions, feel free to jump in anytime.
For sure. Thanks, Christine. I think I will add to just speaking to that question, it depended as well on the resources that parents had available and the locations that they were in. This is our analyses are very preliminary at this point, but we will definitely speak to those issues and gaps in service and all those types of things. So I think that also contributes a lot to, you know, aggravating situations during the pandemic, or yeah, the opposite as well too.
Thank you. Then Karine Tremblay is asking a question about, can you tell about what the parents said about children's rights when their rights are not, I don't know if the sentence was finished, but I'm not sure if she meant if their rights are not respected, or if their rights are not taken into account, or I guess it's children's rights versus parents' rights kind of question, if I understand it. Yeah.
Yes, and I think, yeah, again, not knowing what comes after the not, but I'll just maybe echo a lot of what we had already presented in terms of there were parents who saw it as less of a struggle. There were parents who felt well prepared to engage, or at least to disengage, depending on the strategy that was required. And so for some parents, they were able to disconnect emotionally and see the circumstance for what it was, and to, again, respect that right, in their rights in the moment, especially in terms of care and support. For others, as we saw, it was excessively frustrating. For some parents, it was difficult to see any positive. They were clearly still in survival mode. And so any reflection on rights was in many ways a struggle for them. And again, not that it had to be that vocabulary specifically, but just generally recognizing that on a day-to-day basis, in those heat of the moment, very tense crises, it's difficult to navigate all of the best interests of all of the children. So definitely complicated, but perhaps we can follow up with Kedin later and follow up with a clearer sense of that question.
I think she wrote the parents' right later. So
yeah. Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, but I think you did speak to that as well. And if I can just add to one of the slides that I spoke to, was pointing to that being more challenging when siblings are involved, and when it seems that maybe their rights are not being fulfilled or respected. So I think there's a lot of tension, and that kind of further complicates things. Parents seem to almost, not in all cases, but have a more difficult time when the siblings are involved over themselves too.
And well, we're coming really to the end here of the time we have for this talk, but I'll take a last question here. Have you encountered parents who suffered harm at the hands of their children, who experienced struggles when describing their situation from a criminal law perspective? And was that perspective voiced in what was voiced by parents? Apart from the children's rights perspective, like, did you find parents struggling with this?
Yes, so there's several different considerations there. So, and yeah, again, because of time, we didn't include this specifically, but it could be an entire presentation on its own. And that was the involvement of criminal justice personnel. And so there were definitely many phone calls made to police by parents whose child, and not just adolescents, some children very young, 3, 4, 5 years old, under 10 for sure, whose parents felt they had to call the police in order to mitigate the circumstances. And so parents definitely did communicate with criminal justice staff. Some of the interactions were positive. A lot of times they were counterproductive. Parents were often disappointed with the interactions because they felt that the police service or those who were showing up at their door were not as well prepared to manage the mental health components of the situations. Others felt, in other instances, that the police officers were very supportive and understood the circumstances. So definitely connections connections with the criminal justice system for sure. Again, some positive, some negative experiences. In terms of a full like charging, conviction, sentencing, that was certainly not reported to us in the interviews. I don't recall that being part of any of the responses within the survey either, at least not to that extent, but certainly contact with the system and with varying degrees of satisfaction in that regard. So from a child rights perspective, again, when parents express frustration with the contact with the criminal justice system, it was usually because they were really disappointed with how the police officers handled their child and didn't really view their interaction with the child as a child-centered one, or certainly not well-informed in terms of mental health care for a child as well. So definitely mindful of their child's rights that were compromised or felt that they were not supported as well in those moments. Not sure if that's answering the entire question, but we can definitely revisit it afterwards too.
Yeah, and I can see that there's a lot more to explore from your research and findings, and I look forward to hearing more in the future. I see that Jennifer Quaid, a Vice Dean for Research at the Civil Law Section, has joined. I don't know, Jennifer, est-ce que tu voudrais dire quelques mots à la fin?
Ben, j'ai malheureusement manqué la plupart du webinaire à cause de notre rencontre, mais c'est un sujet qui m'intéresse beaucoup en tant que spécialiste du droit pénal. Alors, je vais certainement réécouter à un autre moment l'échange si possible, mais non, je ne vais pas dire grand-chose sauf pour remercier tout le monde qui a assisté. On a quand même une belle assistance, même si on est au début de la période des examens ici à la faculté de droit. Et j'aimerais remercier nos panélistes pour avoir consacré du temps à partager leurs recherches avec l'auditoire. C'est vraiment un domaine qui demeure relativement inexploré, je pense, et qui a besoin davantage de recherche. Alors, je pense que c'est très intéressant. J'aurais souhaité inviter mes étudiants de première année de droit pénal, mais ils sont en train d'étudier pour mon examen, alors ils ne peuvent pas être là. Mais au nom de la section droit civil et au nom du cycle des conférences en droit civil, je remercie beaucoup le laboratoire interdisciplinaire de la recherche sur les droits de l'enfant, les panélistes, Mona Paré, Caroline Fauché et tous les autres pour avoir organisé ce webinaire. Mona, je te cède la parole.
Merci, Jennifer. So, yeah, thank you so very much. This was very interesting, as I said, thought-provoking, and also how it's been highlighted by the participants, very important research for Canada. And so thank you for that. And we look forward to hearing more once your next phases, when you continue with the next phases. So there'll be definitely space for another a meeting like this, another webinar, another midi-conférence du laboratoire. Merci.
Merci à vous, Mona, et aussi Jennifer. And to Elisa and Danica.
Merci,
Thank you, everyone.
Danica.
Merci.
Au revoir. Bonne journée.